Ruth L. Miller integrates new understanding of consciousness and culture in a way that the rest of us can understand. With degrees in anthropology, environmental studies, cybernetics, and system science, she worked as a futurist and organizational community development consultant and taught in several colleges and universities around the Pacific Northwest. Now in her second career, the Reverend Dr. Miller serves as an ordained New Thought minister in Unity, Science of Mind, Unitary churches around Oregon. Dr. Miller has written over 24 books on the history and power of applied metaphysics and dozens of reports on historical trends and future impacts of present actions. She is the host of a regular radio program called Noetic Moments on the science of consciousness. Is a regular contributor to the magazine Divine CEO and manages several websites and a YouTube channel to provide broader access to her writing, interviews, classes and presentations. I do have a personal contact with Dr. Miller. In 2006, she started a company called Wise Woman Press. I was invited to join that company. I was a member, and in 2009, I bought out her because I wanted more books out than she could do. She was a minister. She had other obligations. I was pressing. Since that time, I've published over 50 books. Wise Woman Press publishes all of Emma Curtis Hopkins' books. Now Ruth Miller's taking over the business part of Wise Woman Press, and I'll be able to just create more books. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Miller.
So I am here to kind of integrate the futurist and the New Thought minister. I hope that's okay. That's what I'm doing at this stage in my career. So before Wise Woman Press happened, I wrote a little book called 150 Years of Healing. Some of you have seen this. And it was my attempt to provide my students with kind of an overview of the rather complex process by which our current situation has emerged. 10, 20 years later, I put out a new edition, The Science of Mental Healing. Nobody liked this title. Same book, new edition. This year, it's called Healing by Words Alone. And it's been updated. As he pointed out, I do a radio show called Noetic Moments. And noetic means mind or consciousness. Consciousness is something that most of us are totally unaware of. It's who we are. I think we're good? We're good. Oh, look at that. It's who we are, but it's who all of everything is also. Yes? Yeah, we call it the one. And what this means in my systems world is because it's all one, we can never do just one thing. Whatever any being does in the all that is connected to and interconnected with everything in the all that is. So, new thought. This is David Alexander's chart. It's a very nice one. I don't agree with all the details because, well, I've been doing this longer than he has. This is a chart that my students brought to me that explains, the connections between all the people that are involved in New Thought. And again, I don't agree with all the details, but it's marvelous to see the interconnections, isn't it? Because we tend to think we're isolated individuals. Well, frankly, that is the purpose of that part of mind we call ego, to keep us feeling isolated and separated. So anything we can do to help us understand the interconnectedness is really helpful. It's rewiring the brain. Well, this is my version. This is the one I've been using the last few years. I do a little online class I call Meet the Teachers. And every now and then we pull one of these out and we look at how they're interconnected. And really, that's what the books are about. It's who taught who, when, what, and what they took away with it. And what they take away is their own individualization of the concepts that were presented to them. You don't know anything about that. So one of the things that happened in all of this is that people began to realize that there was more to it than their own personal discovery. So I know that it's much too small. I get that. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it up. And this is the context that we were operating from, that two primary people were operating in and from in the 1850s. That's why in the year 2000, 1999 actually, I called it 150 years of healing, right? I can't call it that anymore. But this is the context. And the two men are Quimby, the technician, the engineer with the patents, Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Both of them New Englanders. Both of them, very much engaged in their community. I'm assuming you all know these names. Am I correct? Okay, if you need a biography, I've got biographies, okay? But they're drawing on a lot of material, a long history. And it took one of the students of one of their students to begin to make sense of that. I'm happy to go over details later. I could spend a whole term on this, couldn't I? But then what Quimby did, he's the technician. There was actually a writer in the 1860s that said in the transcendentalist movement, Emerson is the philosopher and Quimby is the engineer. Isn't that marvelous? I love it. So Quimby has this experience, and the version of it I like best is that he had to sell his business. He was failing. It was awful. His family was struggling because he had the respiratory condition that virtually everybody had in a world where you don't have vacuum cleaners, but you got dogs and cats and cattle and horses and open fireplaces and chimneys coming, all kinds of new factories and dirt roads. Can you imagine what your respiratory system was going through? Right? So he was having consumption, and he was dying, and the doctors were giving him poisons to kill the consumption, and that was helping him die. And so the story is that someone told him they went up for a horseback ride, and they got over their consumption. Well, he was too weak to get in a horseback ride and get up on a horse, so his dad was a blacksmith. He went to the livery stable, and he said, "Can I use a cart, please?" And the guy got him up into a horse cart, sent him off on the road, and the horse gets mired in the mud. And there's nothing he can do. He's too weak. And a farmer finally takes pity on him and comes and gives the horse a big whack on the rear. And the horse goes charging off down the road, all the way around, back into town to the livery stable. Quimby never had the symptoms of consumption again. And he was an engineer technician kind of type. In fact, he used the scientific method for a lot of things. He had patents. He spent the rest of his life trying to figure that out. And so this guy named Charles Poyen came to town to talk about Mesmer and talk about what he was able to do with hypnosis. And he says, maybe that's related. And so he starts exploring hypnosis. And for several years, he goes around every winter, because you can't get around in New England on dirt roads in the muddy right at the time. So in the wintertime, you can take a sleigh on the snow, and it works, right? It's the opposite of today. Right? So he's going around every winter, and he's doing these demonstrations of hypnosis. And the guy that he's working most often with is this 19-year-old kid who starts saying things like, you know that necklace you're missing? Look up in the attic It's up there, in the third drawer in the dresser. Or, you know that guy that's over at sea, he'll be back in about 2.5 weeks. And he's saying these things in hypnotic trance, and Quimby's going, what? And he started hearing also, it sounded sometimes as if the kid, Lucius Burkhardt, was saying things that were going on in Quimby's mind. That freaked him out. So he tried an experiment because he liked using the scientific method, which is why Francis Bacon is one of the links to Quimby in the other slide. And the experiment is, Lucius is sitting in a chair. He's doing his demonstration. And Quimby imagines a roaring lion coming on the stage to go after Lucius. Lucius jumps up and runs away. Yeah. Quimby got it. Minds are connected. They are not isolated. We are not isolated individuals. There is no separation. A couple of other things happened, and Quimby said, okay, I got it. But this is not about hypnosis. This is not about mesmerism. There's something else going on here. He never used hypnosis again in his life. And between 1850 and 1867, 12,000 cases were symptom-free because Quimby understood that it was what people believed that was causing their symptoms. And he helped them change their belief. I sometimes wonder if Joe Dispenza is Quimby reincarnated. So one of Quimby's patients was an itinerant dentist wife who was a homeopathic homeopathic medical doctor. And her name was Mary Baker Glover Patterson. That was his student, first his patient. And then she said, I need to learn how to do this, because she had seen, as a student, she had seen that if she gave a patient something that that patient believed in, that patient got well, whether what she was giving them had any medicinal value at all. Interesting. She saw this. So she understood what it was Quimby was doing, and Quimby undid her lifelong back pain. And then she had a fall. And the back pain returned. Only Quimby had passed on. So she did what she did normally when she went to a new town. She rented a room. She took her Bible and she took all her notes and a couple of journals and sat down and reinvented what Quimby had done for her. And then she created the little guidebook. It once was really very short, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She divorced Dr. Patterson very soon thereafter, went around teaching this process, moved into Lynn, Massachusetts, proceeded to help people as Mrs. Glover. She dropped the Patterson. She proceeded to help people. It's in the newspapers of Lynn, Massachusetts, all kinds of marvelous, miraculous stories. And in 1876, she teaches her first class, and among her students is a man named Asa Eddy. And Asa Eddy tells her, if you will marry me, I'll take you to Boston, and we'll create a real school where you can teach these things. So Mary Baker Eddy formed the Metaphysical College of Massachusetts. All of these folks created schools. None of them created churches until their students insisted on it. And I think from last night, that's something we want to carry forward. Well, one of Mrs. Eddy's students was a woman whose family had been dealing with respiratory issues. And a neighbor had come over and said, come over for tea. I have a friend visiting, and I'd like you to meet her. And Mrs. Eddy was the friend, and Mrs. Hopkins was the woman. And Mrs. Eddy proceeded to talk about Christian Science as she knew it, as we think of it today. And Mrs. Hopkins said, I don't think so. No. She knew too much about chemistry and biology. She had been a high school teacher. She understood the science of the day. There was no way that this could possibly work. But that was in the summer. Come the fall, that respiratory thing starts coming around again, and the whole family's really sick, and the doctors can do nothing, and the neighbor comes over and says, please, let me try. In 24 hours, the whole family is symptom-free, and Mrs. Hopkins is writing a letter to Mrs. Eddy saying, I need to know what you do, how you do it, and I need it from the teacher's mouth, right? And so what we have in Mrs. Hopkins is someone who understood all of these people, and that's when it begins to become evident. So she takes Mrs. Eddy's lessons, and as Michael has demonstrated, and we'll hear more about this evening, or this afternoon, her very first lessons are almost identical to Mrs. Eddy's. But as she goes on, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, she starts bringing in more and more of these other people and their teachings and their understandings, and more of her lectures, these stream of consciousness lectures in Victorian prose that most of us can hardly stand to read because the books are transcripts of these lectures. Oh my goodness, and she's including Antiochus and Plotinus and Iamblichus, and my students are going, who? What? Because they don't have the education she had, right? Well, she ended up teaching, as the records that I've seen, 1,100 students with 11,000 documented cures. Most of her students had to, her cures were people that went through all 12 lessons, so they became students. And 110 people became ordained through Mrs. Hopkins' work. Now, the ones we generally focus on are the ones that are on the chart here. But can you imagine? At one point, she had 500 Emma Hopkins study groups around the country, around the world. Yeah. This was in the 1890s, the turn of that century. By 1906, she said, okay, I've done my work, I'm done. And she started focusing on the mystical life. Oh my goodness, the mystical life. She loved it. And there's lots of material out there about that. So these other folks each took these ideas. Now, I have 2 arrows going to Melinda Kramer that most folks in divine science might not agree with because there is very little evidence. And like Mary Baker Eddy, who disclaimed having had anything to do with Quimby, Melinda says, nope, this is all me. I don't have any precursors, no teachers. I'm having a hard time with that one. I'm working on her biography. I think there was a little input there. So that's what those 2 arrows are for. But she was amazing. Melinda Kramer is an absolutely amazing being. And developed this home of truth, the home college there. Again, a college, not a church. And then through wonderful stories, we have this woman, Kate Bingham, in Pueblo, Colorado, which happens to be where I was born. And when I was starting to learn this in my ministry training, Reverend Jody Stevenson, yes, some of you know her name. She was my instructor, and she had us, passed around the envelope. She says, we're going to do this with divine selection, and you're going to pull out a slip of paper, and this is the person you're going to impersonate for the rest of the class, so the rest of the class can learn their teachings. One of our little Japanese woman got Albert Einstein. That was fun. She came in with a wig and a mustache. It was beautiful. Well, I got a woman named Nona Brooks, and I had never heard of Nona Brooks. But the first thing I saw was she was living in Pueblo, Colorado, which is where I was born. And it turned out her story overlapped my family story kind of interestingly. So I got really hooked on Nona Brooks. And she learned from this woman, Kate Bingham, who had gone to Chicago to deal with an inoperable, uncurable form of something, and went to Chicago and got misdirected or redirected to Emma Hopkins, and had her life turned around. And Emma's way of teaching, which was contrary to Mary Baker Eddy's teaching, is make it your own and keep teaching it. Make it your own and keep teaching it. I love this. So Mrs. Bingham starts rounding up all these people, and the Brooks sisters, Nona and Fanny and Alethea, there's a mistype in that. That's a copy from my student's chart. Alethea. They are being very good, and Nona has this health problem, and so she says, please come to my class. And they go to their minister, and the minister says, well, I don't see anything wrong with this. And so they go to the class, and they're all very, very good. They all do everything Emma tells them to do through Mrs. Bingham. One of the things I've learned, and many, many times I've taught Emma Hopkins 12 lessons, people don't like doing what she says. And then they're surprised they don't get the results. This is weird. She offered 12 lessons. She offered a daily practice, morning and afternoon. In my Unveiling Your Hidden Power, I took those practices out and labeled Monday morning, Wednesday morning, Thursday afternoon. Anyway, she did all of that. And she basically said, keep these ideas in your mind all the time. All the time. Not just Sunday mornings, not just when you're doing your spiritual practice, all the time. So Nona and her sisters are doing their chores, right? And they're feeding the chickens. God is good. God is everywhere. God is good, right? And they're making the beds. My God is my good, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. And then they're making dinner, and they're doing all the chores in a small town in outside of Puebla, Colorado in the 1800s, right? Oh my goodness. So they come back for the second class, and the second class is, there is no evil in omnipresent good, right? There is no way that anyone can be sick, because God is health, and health is omnipotent and omnipresent. And they're hearing this, and they're saying this now for the next week. My good is omnipresent. There is no sickness because God is omnipresent. And they do this for another week, and then they go back for the third week. And the third week is the affirmations. You've cleared the way with the negations for the positive, the powerful affirmations. I live and move and have my being in the God of my understanding. Woo! And they're repeating this. But in that third week, Nona is listening, and the room lights up. And there is a sense of a presence. And the presence says, what is your heart's desire? And she says, well, I'd like to be well. And then the room comes back to normal, and class is over, and she's walking out. And she assumes everyone in the room has had this experience, right? Because the room was just filled with this light. And she's getting out into the buggy that they're using to get to and from class. And she's telling her sisters, I'm healed, I'm well. They say, good, keep doing your affirmations. I love these stories. It wasn't until she ate a full meal that night that they knew she was well. And she went on. I found estimates of 13,000 people who were healed because Nona Brooks practiced Emma's lessons and developed her own approach, which is what Emma would have loved, and I'm sure did. So each of these people has done that. Ernest Holmes was her very last student. In 1918, they were at an INTA meeting. Emma was the president that year, and it was Ernest Holmes' first meeting. And he was going around, he was interviewing. He had been in Boston at when he was 16, right after Mary Baker Eddy had turned the church over to the book. And So he had been there to study elocution. So he would go sometimes to the Christian Science Church and listen to people. And he became aware of what they were doing. And so he started interviewing practitioners. And then he and his brother went out to California, and they did more of this kind of thing. And in 1918, they came back for the INTA meeting, and he's interviewing everybody in sight, including Nona Brooks. And he wants to interview Mrs. Hopkins, and she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Nope, I don't think so." And he goes back to California and does marvelous things with his brother. I love all the things that they did between 1917 and 1924. And then he came back for another meeting in 1924. And this time, Mrs. Hopkins has had an episode of God's, not so much an illness, as God putting an end to a career. And she is staying in one of her favorite hotels in New York, which is how she lived her mystical life during the wintertime. And she grants him an interview. And he shows up, and she's dressed for going out. He describes her in this marvelous black gown and hat and white gloves, and her hair is snow white, and she has violet eyes. And he sits, she invites him into the room. She sits on the edge of the bed. He gets the chair, and she starts telling him, lesson 1. 12 sessions later, he calls his brother. I don't think it was on the phone, but it might have been, because it was 1924. And he says, "You know that book that you wrote a few years ago, you called Science of Mind? I need that title. I have it figured out. I know what it is." And in 1925, Science of Mind was published. He was Emma's last student. I love that, too. It's all woven together, and no one person can do one thing. And then all these people started to try to explain how this stuff works. Now, Thomas was outside of that loop. In England, they call him Troward, by the way, Thomas Troward, Judge Troward. And he had been in India. He was born in India. He was born in what we call Sri Lanka today, had grown up there, and then sent back to England for school, because that's what boys did in those days. And and he thought he was going to be a painter. But no, they said, you got to have to earn a living. So he became a lawyer. And then he took the exam for civil service, and they sent him back to India. He already spoke Hindi. Now he had to learn Urdu, because they sent him to the Punjab. But he also had to deal with Jews and Muslims and Buddhists, and oh, wow. So he learned to read Sanskrit and Hebrew. Well, he had the Hebrew from school, but he built up on that. And he started working with all of these different people, with all these different religious traditions. If you've ever been in the Punjab, you can see it. You can feel the mixture. It's kind of like America in that way. And so he became a magistrate for all of these people with all of these issues, being the representative of British justice. And he had some incredible psychic experiences, which he details in several of his books. And I outlined briefly in my little biography of him. So Troward began to realize that there is much more to the integration of all of these different ways of thinking than you can find in any one. And I love his word, his phrase describing God. He calls it the creative process. What we have always been taught to call God is the creative process. And then one of his books was The Creative Process in the Individual. Marvelous work. He did amazing things. And it was picking up one of his books in Los Angeles in the Metaphysical Library that gave Holmes the impetus to start codifying what it was that he understood. And he picked it up in 1918, I'm told, right before he came to the conference. I don't know that for sure. So all these other people come out of these interactions with these folks who are codifying these things, and most of you recognize most of these names because they are our teachers and our teachers' teachers, right? They made it something that we could all begin to accept. Now, I'm going to suggest that all of us had found our way into it before we found any of these people. Am I right? These people have just reinforced our own individual discovery. And why is that? Because it's all interconnected and you can never do one thing. And so all of us are always discovering this stuff. So what happens in a culture, in our culture, is things start out as this apparently isolated idea. I got two guys down there, Emerson and Quimby, in 1850. And then they slowly, and then more and more quickly, in an exponential curve, begin to expand. And interestingly, 75 years after Emerson and Quimby, we get the publication of Daily Word. We get the publication of Science of Mind. We get the publication of Florence Scovel Shinn's The Game of Life. We get at that point in the mid-20s, we get thousands of people all over this country using the approaches laid out in 1850, 75 years. This is my futurist training. All right, what I've learned long before I knew the New Thought, 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. The guys have been working on it for years, since about 1770, 1760, some of them said, right? And then we have all the way through Europe, all of these feudal systems being turned into democratic republics. The last one, Germany in 1848. 75 years, almost exactly. Isn't that interesting? Cultures do that, right? And I think if we were to start with 1925 and go to 2000, the peak of INTA in Portland, I think we had 2,500 people at Portland that day when INTA met at Portland. You know, I was allowed to be one of the speakers. I appreciate that. And we had a room this size full of book dealers, right? So 75 years, all right? Well, what's happening now? The line is where we are now on the things that started around 1965. Because a lot of things happened besides the Beatles in 1965. All right? We've got the Unitarians and the Universalists coming together and forming their 7 principles, which we'll look at shortly. We have the Environmental Protection Act coming into Congress, which finally is implemented in '69. We've got, the Beatles discovered Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and Transcendental Meditation coming in at the same time. And then we get the Summer of Love. Yeah. Now, I won't get into the hallucinogenics and all of that, too. But the Civil Rights Act, yes, right on 1965, right? We have awakened as a culture in many, many ways in the mid-1960s. Doesn't feel like it looking at today's world, right? I think I have, yes. This is what's happening today. I know. Again, it's all interconnected. This is one of the outputs. I got to play with the model called the limits to growth. It was the world model in Dynamo, and it was one of the things I did in grad school. And so we kept trying to push it out there. They started it in the 50s, and they updated it in the 70s, and they updated it in the 90s. And we'd push it, and we'd push it, and every variable we could. And the furthest I could make this awful moment happen was the 2050s. Ow. Well, we are right about on that line right now, which is why everything looks awful. But you know what's interesting? This is not just about the US. I have a degree in anthropology. I grew up in a group of anthropologists and archaeologists and art historians. And, well, I could say the same thing about the Roman Empire, the Sumerian Empire, the Egyptian Empire. I could say this about every empire since the beginning of empires, 4000 BC. We've had a 6,000-year glitch called empires. I call it empire culture. This is how they all go. Wow. So where are we today? 1965 to 2040. All of these things that were planted as seeds in the same way that Emerson and Quimby were the seeds of New Thought in 1850, that blossomed in the 20s, and then blossomed in a whole new way. You know, the tree became a forest by 2000. But all of these seeds are coming into fruition along about 2040. So this is not disaster. This is telling us what can be, what is bound to happen, the end of a culture based on values of control and fear, and accumulation out of fear and control, and exploitation out of fear and control. That's what this graph tells us. It's coming to an end. And because of the last 75 years of globalization, it's happening worldwide. Humanity is coming out of the glitch that I call empire culture. And all those things that happened in the 1960s are in large part a function of what happened in the 1850s. Yes? Yes. We are part of the emerging age. In all the prophecies of all the indigenous cultures everywhere on the planet, and in some cases even in ancient Western culture, we have prophecies describing a new kind of human experience, a new kind of human world. It's got all kinds of names on it. My favorite is this one: focus on spirituality, healing, and wholeness. And it's the Mayans who say that the new technologies will not be material technologies. They just got us here to this point where we can use spiritual, mental technologies to move to the next development, right? This is what I believe New Thought is evolving into, the fundamental way of being for the whole planet. So the interconnected web of life is the seventh principle in the Unitarian Universalist doctrine, if you will. They don't have a doctrine, they have 7 principles. Acceptance of one another, recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, encouraging a search for truth and meaning, promoting the democratic process where every voice matters, working for justice, equity, and compassion in every interaction, knowing that it is a global community. I think 1965, when those principles were adopted by those very weird people called Unitarians, integrating with the Universalists. Now, I say that. I was born into a Unitarian family, and my first church experiences were all Unitarian. And I'm working with a Unitarian congregation now. And it's marvelous to see this. But they tend to forget that Unitarian is a theology. It's about God. A lot of Unitarians don't like that G word. It's hard. But it means there is only one. All that is only one. And we are part of that. And in 85, they added the interconnected web of life that we are part of. Life, as we know, is one of the names of our good that we call God. Yes? Yes. The interconnected web of beingness that is who and what we are. Yes? So, we are one people. We are one planet in a creative process, the one that Troward called the creative process. Yes? I love this. And it's all an eternal field that is a loving intelligence. Now, how do I know that? Well, I told you I'm doing this show called Noetic Moments. I do it every week. You can go online. You can check it out. I've done 116 half-hour shows. And I have to learn something almost every time. Isn't that fun? I love learning. And what is very, 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 very clear is that nothing is happening here except receiving and transmitting. Everything is happening in this field that surrounds me that I can pump out into the room or I can bring right in here. That field that is the consciousness that I am, the mind that I am. But fields cannot exist in isolation. Every field is part of a larger field, is part of a larger field, is part of a larger field to the infinite field that is what scientists like to call the quantum field, the zero-point field, any number of other terms for that out of which all matter and energy arise. Where's information? Gregory Bateson came up with what I think is the best definition of information. It's the pattern that connects. Isn't that marvelous? So the pattern in all that matter and energy is the information that is what I've been experiencing as spiritual downloads, right? It is what we tap into when we surrender. It is what we have called intuition. It is what the medium or channel is accessing at any given time. It is why I go to the alpha level to have access into an infinite field that contains all the information of anything that has ever happened, anytime, or ever could happen. Infinite possibilities, past and future both, in the quantum field, in patterns. And as each of us focuses our attention, our consciousness on this larger consciousness, the pattern that resonates with who I am is the pattern I can access. Rupert Sheldrake calls that morphogenetic fields. We resonate. We resonate. No matter where we are from here on out, whatever any of us does will encourage and make it easier for everyone else in this room to do. Isn't that great? Please keep on working. Make it easier. Yes. So this way of being and thinking that we have been studying and teaching all of these years and are wondering, there's only a few people in my room. What do I do? Just keep on. Because people are resonating with you all over the planet. And they are improved, enhanced, increased in their ability to experience this. Every word you say, every thought you think. Emma is right on, Emma Hopkins, when she tells us, keep these ideas in your mind continually. And what that does is allow the brain to align so that it receives and transmits what the mind is able to access from the infinite. And that is the evolving, interconnected web of new thought and humanity's transformation. Thank you.